Peter Parker had already lost one life before he actually died. By the end of No Way Home, everyone who mattered to him had forgotten he existed, including MJ and Ned. That being so, he still chose to keep being Spider-Man. Years later, that choice would eventually cost him his life. But that wasn't the end. Peter was born as Yuji Itadori. At first, Yuji had no idea there had ever been another life. He grew up normally, with no spider powers or memories of NYC. Eventually, small pieces started coming back. Places he'd never been, people he'd never met, and fights he didn't remember fighting. By the time Yuji became involved with Jujutsu, Peter's old memories were already starting to affect the way he thought and fought. He didn't have Spider-Man's powers anymore, but he still remembered how Peter Parker was selfless and protected people. Yuji didn't wake up one morning with Peter Parker's entire life in his head. The memories came back slowly enough that for years, he didn't even realize they were memories. He'd recognize places he never visited. New York felt familiar even though he never went there. Some morning, he would wake up knowing the names of May, MJ, or Ned. As he got older, those fragments started connecting. The clearest memories were usually bad ones. May dying. At this point, he didn't have the emotional connection with May as he does being Peter Parker. Memories of fighting Green Goblin. Then there was the last memory of Peter Parker's life. Whatever had finally killed him years after, everyone had forgotten who he was. It was only when Yuji reached high school that he realized he had been Peter Parker. That didn't suddenly make Yuji feel like he was living someone else's life. Wasuke was still his grandfather. His childhood in Sendai was still his childhood. Peter's memories felt more like another part of himself that had taken years to surface. Those memories did change him though. Yuji had always been unusually willing to help people. He remembered what happened when Peter looked away from something because he thought it wasn't his problem. He also remembered Peter's resilience. Years of fighting people stronger than him, making decisions under pressure, and finding ways out of situations that should have killed him. None of Peter's physical abilities carried over. Yuji didn't have spider sense. He couldn't stick to walls or produce webs. The strength Yuji had was already his own. He'd been unusually strong, long before he knew anything about cursed energy, and Peter's memories didn't change that. The only thing that changed was how he used it. This only started to matter once Megami Fushiguro came looking for the cursed object at Yuji's school. Yuji's first encounter with curses still began at school. Megami came looking for Sukuna's finger, only to discover that the seal around it had already been removed. By the time Yuji reached the school, the people inside were in danger, and curses had gathered around the finger. Peter's memories didn't give Yuji a hidden solution here. He still couldn't see curses properly before entering the situation, and he still knew nothing about cursed energy. Those memories changed how quickly he accepted the danger once he saw it. Yuji entered the school and fought with the same physical ability he already had in canon, but Peter's combat experience was starting to affect how he used it. Old instincts helped him judge distance and use the environment around him to his advantage. But this was not enough. Against a curse, normal strength could only take him so far. Yuji eventually reached the same desperate choice that eventually changed his life originally, and swallowed Sukuna's finger to gain cursed energy. Canonically, Yuji does this while trying to save his friends, becoming Sukuna's vessel in the process. The moment Sukuna appeared, Peter's memories made Yuji understand that this wasn't anything like gaining another power. Yuji had no way of knowing exactly what Sukuna was yet, but his memories of Peter's experience with danger told him that something willing to take control of his body couldn't be treated lightly. When Yuji regained control, that was the first thing he wanted to understand. Then Gojo entered his life. Once Yuji learned what cursed energy actually was, Peter's old way of thinking became useful in a completely different way. He wanted to know why cursed energy behaved differently depending on emotion. He paid attention to where it moved through his body during a strike. He noticed the lag between his natural speed and the cursed energy right behind it. He kept adjusting his timing and speed. Peter's intelligence doesn't necessarily make him stronger than everyone around him, but it makes him learn everything much faster. Yuji's first few months as a sorcerer forced him to relearn how to fight. Peter spent years relying on a body that could react to danger before he saw it, and move with far more freedom than a normal person. Not to mention he could stick to walls. Yuji had none of that. His body was already far stronger and faster than an ordinary human, but the advantages were different, and trying to copy Spider-Man exactly would not be the best choice. Peter remembered how to read an opponent while fighting, how to notice habits, and how to change an approach when something wasn't working. Yuji started applying those instincts to close-range combat. He would watch where opponents looked before attacking. He would test their reaction to pressure and became more comfortable changing his timing instead of throwing every punch the same way. Yuji's natural speed created a problem because his cursed energy initially couldn't keep up with his strikes. The first impact came from his fist, followed by a second impact when the cursed energy hit. Gojo recognized this as Divergent Fist. At first, Yuji found the delay interesting because of Peter's old combat experience. 2 impacts from one punch sounded useful, until Yuji started training with Todo during the Goodwill event. But Yuji understood the difference. Instead of trying to preserve Divergent Fist, because it was unusual, he worked on fixing the flaw it had. He had to make cursed energy, and his body move as one. That meant breaking habits carried over from Peter's old fighting style. Todo's training pushed him towards that control. Yuji entered the fight, knowing that one mistake could get him or Todo killed. Todo also told him that he wouldn't help until Yuji managed to land Black Flash. Black Flash occurs when cursed energy is applied within a small fraction of a second after a hit. Even experienced sorcerers can't activate it when they want. Yuji stopped thinking about Peter's old body. He stopped forcing cursed energy into his strike and and focused on getting Yuji's movement and cursed energy to work together. Then he landed it. Black Flash had shown him cursed energy in a way his regular training hadn't. Once he reached this state, his control improved drastically. During the fight with Hanami, he managed 4 Black Flashes in succession, which matched Nanami's record. Now, getting better at Jujutsu didn't make Yuji any better at dealing with what came with it. Junpei was one of the first reminders. Yuji tried to reach him before Mahito could pull him any further in, but wanting to save someone didn't guarantee that he could. Mahito still transfigured Junpei in front of him, and Yuji couldn't reverse what had been done. Yuji carried memories of seeing people die in Peter's life. That didn't make watching it happen again easier. If anything, having both lives made the failure worse. Yuji remembered Mei dying because Peter couldn't save her. He remembered everyone Peter had lost before that. Now, there was another name attached to that same feeling. Mahito also taught him something Peter's previous enemies never could. There were curses Yuji couldn't reason with. Peter had spent much of his first life holding back. Even when someone was trying to kill him, his goal was normally to stop them. Jujutsu forced Yuji into situations where that rule couldn't always survive. Mahito wasn't a damaged person who could be restrained and handed over to someone else. He was a curse that deliberately reshaped humans for his own amusement. When Sukuna took control, Yuji could do nothing while his own body was used to kill on a scale Peter had never experienced. Sukuna's fight with Jogo devastated a large part of Shibuya, and his later use of Malevolent Shrine caused even more destruction. When Yuji regained control, he was left standing in the aftermath. His first instinct was to blame himself. Peter had spent years taking responsibility for anything he believed he could have prevented. Yuji already carried a similar tendency, and putting those two histories together made Sukuna's actions almost impossible for him to process. It didn't matter that Sukuna had been controlling the body. Yuji had swallowed the fingers. Sukuna was inside him. To Yuji, that was enough to make the deaths feel like his responsibility. Then Shibuya kept taking people from him. Yuji watched Mahito kill Nanami. Shortly after, Nobara was struck by idol transfiguration while fighting Mahito, leaving Yuji believing he'd lost her too. But then, there wasn't much separating Peter's old grief from Yuji's new one. He stopped fighting for a moment because he genuinely couldn't see the point anymore. Kodo was the one who pulled him back into the battle. He reminded Yuji that the sorcerers who had died had entrusted something to the people still alive. Yuji couldn't undo what had happened to Nanami or everyone Sukuna had killed, but he could decide what happened next. By the time Sukuna took Megami's body, Yuji had already spent months learning how dangerous it was to depend on strength alone. Against Sukuna, that lesson mattered more than ever. Peter's experience didn't give him some hidden plan for beating the strongest sorcerer in history. Most of what Sukuna could do was completely outside anything Peter had dealt with before. What Peter could bring to the table was his habit of learning while a fight was happening. If something worked once, Yuji paid attention to why. He changed it instead of repeating the same attack and hoping for a different result. The month before the fight in Shinjuku gave him more tools than he'd ever had before. Yuji consumed the remaining death painting wounds, which helped him gain access to blood manipulation through the connection with his brothers. He also trained reverse curse technique, giving him a way to heal injuries that would have ended his fights earlier in the series. Neither ability came easy. Yuji wasn't suddenly as skilled with blood manipulation as Choso, and healing himself still required cursed energy and concentration. That was exactly the kind of problem Peter's memories had taught Yuji to work through. He couldn't turn Jujutsu into normal science, but he understood his own body well enough to make blood manipulation practical. Instead of trying to copy everything Choso could do, Yuji focused on techniques that worked with the way he already fought. Controlling his blood helped him recover from damage and gave him another option when an enemy created distance. Then, Yuji saw Shrine awaken during the fight with Sukuna. Sukuna's curse technique had been engraved into Yuji after sharing his body for so long, but Yuji's version didn't appear exactly the way Sukuna used it. When it finally surfaced after Yuji's string of black flashes, he had another ability he barely understood in the middle of the hardest fight of his life. That became especially important once Yuji understood that he could target the boundary between Sukuna and Megami's souls. Instead of only trying to damage Sukuna's body, he could attack the connection keeping Sukuna inside Megami. Peter had spent years looking for ways to win without destroying the person he was trying to save. Yuji had spent months refusing to abandon Megami, even when Sukuna had taken almost everything from him. Yuji eventually pushed himself even further and opened his own domain. He still wasn't more skilled than Sukuna, but he didn't need to become another Sukuna to beat him. The entire fight had been about separating the King of Curses from the people who'd use as vessels. When Sukuna was finally torn away from Megami, Yuji was still willing to give him one last chance to return to his body rather than die, but Sukuna refused. Peter Parker had spent his first life trying to save people whenever there was something left to save. Yuji Itadori had reached the same conclusion after seeing far worse things than Peter ever had. But Sukuna's death did not end Yuji's life as a sorcerer. For a while, things were almost normal again. Megami survived, Nobara was alive, Yuji kept taking missions, and the world slowly moved forward without Sukuna hanging over it. Then the years started passing. Yuji noticed that everyone around him was changing faster than he was. Decades passed, and Yuji still looked young. By the time of Modulo, 68 years had passed since the events surrounding Sukuna. Yet Yuji was still alive and physically far younger than somebody his age should have been. His altered body after everything involving Sukuna and the death paintings had left him with a lifespan far beyond that of an ordinary human. For Yuji, everyone else kept getting older. Friends retired, their bodies weakened. New sorcerers appeared who knew the names Gojo and Sukuna, and the culling games as history instead of memories. Yuji remembered all of it. He remembered being a teenager standing beside Megami and Nobara, and now he had to watch the same generation reach the end of lives that his body seemed determined to outlast. Peter's memories made that harder in a different way. His first life had already taught him what it felt like to lose everyone around him. His second life had finally given him people again. Now time was taking them too. Yuji gradually withdrew. It wasn't because he'd stopped caring about people. The opposite was closer to the truth. After enough funerals, forming another connection meant knowing that there was a good chance that he'd eventually be standing at that person's funeral too. That isolation carried into the person Yuji became by 2086. But he didn't spend those decades doing nothing. His curse techniques kept developing. Blood manipulation and shrine were no longer abilities that he'd awakened in the middle of one desperate battle. He had decades to understand them, combine them with his close-range fighting style, and remove weaknesses that only existed because he'd originally learned everything so quickly. By the time the next major crisis reached Japan, Yuji wasn't the inexperienced vessel that Gojo had once brought into Jujutsu High. He was one of the last people alive who personally remembered the world before it. Then a spaceship arrived, carrying 50,000 Symorans. They were an alien species capable of using Jujutsu, and they came to Earth looking for somewhere their people could live. Japan quickly became central to the situation because cursed energy and sorcery were already deeply tied to the country. Maru was sent to work with Tsurugi and Yuko Kotsu, while both sides tried to determine whether humans and Symorans could actually live together. Yuji's first reaction would have been very different from most sorcerers. Peter had already seen aliens before. He fought alongside some of them, fought against others, and nearly died on another planet because of Thanos. That meant the fact that the Symorans came from somewhere else wouldn't tell Yuji anything about whether they were dangerous. He'd want to know what they actually wanted. Tens of thousands of beings capable of using cursed energy had arrived on Earth, and nobody could guarantee what would happen if relations collapsed. At the same time, treating the entire species as an enemy before they'd done anything would only make that outcome more likely. He spent part of his first life being blamed for things Spider-Man hadn't done. In his second, he'd been sentenced to death simply because Sukuna existed inside of him. He knew what it felt like to have people look at what you could become and decide that was enough to judge who you already were. Maru had already been placed alongside Yuka and Tsurugi as a part of the effort to test whether coexistence was possible. Yuji would want that process to continue instead of letting fear make the decisions first. That didn't mean he trusted the Symorans blindly. Peter had learned that lesson too many times. Yuji would pay close attention to their curse techniques, how their society worked, and whether their leaders were telling Japan everything. He'd also watch how Japanese Jujutsu authorities responded, because either side could turn a tense situation into a disaster. For decades, Yuji had mostly kept himself away from the next generation. The Symorans gave him a reason to stop doing that. If this situation was handled badly, Tsurugi and Yuka could inherit a war. Now Maru was exactly the kind of person Yuji wouldn't want judged by his species. He was a Symorian representative, but he wasn't simply there to threaten Japan or prepare an invasion. He worked directly with Yuka and Tsurugi and showed genuine interest in Earth and the people living there. That made him one of the most important pieces of the entire coexistence effort. Yuji would recognize something familiar in that situation. See, Peter Parker had spent most of his first life living behind a mask while people argued about what Spider-Man was. Yuji's second life had been even worse. For a long time, almost every major decision about his future came back to Sukuna. People who barely knew Yuji were willing to kill him, all because of what lived inside his body. Maru faced a different version of that same problem. Every mistake he made could become evidence against his entire species. That's where Yuji's involvement as Reborn with Peter's memories could begin changing the original course of events. He wouldn't treat Maru like someone who constantly needed to prove that Symorans deserved to exist on Earth. He judged individual actions as they happened. If Maru helped someone, that mattered. If another Symorian did something dangerous, Yuji wouldn't automatically place that guilt on Maru. At the same time, Peter's memories would keep Yuji from becoming naive about the larger situation. Thanos had also believed he was helping people. Mysterio had built an entire false identity around appearing heroic. Peter had learned the hard way that understanding somebody's motivation didn't mean accepting what they did. Yuji would carry that lesson into every conversation surrounding the Symorians. He could understand why displaced people were desperate for somewhere to live without agreeing that desperation gave them the right to harm humans. That approach would also affect Tsurugi and Yuka. Instead of simply telling them what to think, Yuji would force them to separate fear from evidence. After all, they were the ones actually working alongside Maru. They'd seen how he behaved when nobody was asking him to represent his entire species. In reality, Yuji's body had carried Sukuna, absorbed the remaining death painting wounds, and changed so much over the decades that he no longer aged like a normal person. Peter's memories only complicated that further. Yuji had effectively lived in two different worlds already. That made the arrival of a third feel less impossible than it did to everyone else. For the first time in years, Yuji was standing beside them, trying to make sure they didn't repeat the same mistakes his generation had already made. The situation finally broke apart once the fighting spread across Tokyo. At that point, Yuji had more than enough power to throw himself into the biggest battle he could find. He could have gone after Dabura, or stepped into what was happening between Maru and Tsurugi, but he didn't. Yuji had spent long enough fighting besides other sorcerers to know that being the strongest person nearby didn't mean every fight belonged to him. Yuka had her own battle with Dabura, while Tsurugi and Maru were dealing with something Yuji couldn't solve by simply arriving and hitting harder. Tokyo had another problem. Cursed spirits were spreading through the city. and ordinary people were caught in the middle. That was where Yuji went. He started moving through the affected areas and exorcising anything threatening civilians. Decades of experience showed immediately. The Yuji who had once needed several punches to understand an opponent was gone. He could reinforce his body, use shrine at close range, and switch between techniques without having to stop and think through every step. When Osuki attacked him, Yuji took the attack, controlled the exchange, and landed a black flash. The bigger difference in this version was what happened after. See, Peter's memories that trained Yuji to think beyond the opponent standing directly in front of him. While moving through Tokyo, he'd been paying attention to where curses were gathering, which areas had already been evacuated, and which sorcerers were being pulled away from more important positions. That allowed him to treat the outbreak like one connected problem, instead of dozens of separate fights. He didn't need to personally exorcise every curse. If another sorcerer could handle one area, Yuji moved on. If civilians were trapped somewhere, that took priority. If a curse was slowing him down without posing as an immediate threat to anyone else, he had no reason to waste time proving he could beat it. Peter's memories only reinforced that instinct. He had learned the same lesson in another life. Being able to intervene didn't always mean intervention would help, so he trusted Yuka and Tsurugi and kept Tokyo from collapsing around them. Once the immediate fighting began to settle, Yuji finally reached the part of the crisis that brute force couldn't fix. Maru wanted a lasting answer to the problem of cursed spirits. That eventually brought the two of them into the pathway of souls, where the situation became much stranger than another battle in Tokyo. Maru's plan involved Mahito, whose technique could interact directly with souls. For Yuji, seeing Mahito again would have brought back one of the worst periods of his life, but this wasn't Shibuya anymore. Mahito was restored to full power, and the first thing he did was challenge Yuji. Decades earlier, that fight had nearly broken Yuji. Now he had become far stronger, and more importantly, Mahito no longer had the same advantage over him. Yuji understood souls, had spent years developing attacks that could target them directly, and had already fought Sukuna at a level far beyond the teenager Mahito once tormented. Once Mahito was under control, Maru could move forward with a ritual of harmony. Yuji wasn't replacing Maru's solution. Peter's memories simply made him more cautious about accepting a permanent change to cursed energy. Before agreeing to move forward, Yuji pushed Maru to work through the consequences and safeguards with him. If Mahito's technique was going to alter the relationship between the soul, the body, and cursed energy, they needed to know what the ritual was changing, who it could affect, and what would happen if something went wrong. That extra scrutiny didn't create a different ritual. It made Yuji more deliberate about helping Maru carry out the plan they already had, instead of treating Mahito like a weapon they only needed to point in the right direction. The ritual of harmony eventually succeeded. The cursed spirit spreading through Tokyo disappeared, and Yuka and Tsurugi survived the damage they suffered during the conflict. By the time Yuji reaches the end of the story, Peter Parker's memories have been a part of him for decades, shaping how he fights, how he thinks, and how he responds when someone else is in danger. They were never a second consciousness inside him. They were memories of a life Yuji now understood as his own past. But Yuji's second life changed those memories too. Peter used to carry every failure like it was his responsibility to fix everything himself. Yuji learned that sometimes helping people means trusting them, stepping back when someone else has to fight their own battle, and accepting that saving everyone was never something one person could do. He was still carrying Peter Parker with him. He just wasn't living Peter Parker's life anymore.